tuo amore buio, non perderti per niente al mondo. Via, via, non perderti per niente al mondo. Lo spettacolo d'arte varia di uno innamorato di te. It's wonderful, it's wonderful, it's wonderful. You'd like my baby. It's wonderful, it's wonderful, it's wonderful. I dream of you. Chips, chips. Da-di-do-do-do, chibo, chibo, da-di-do-do-do, chibo, chibo, da-di-do-do-do. I dream of you. Con me. Entra in questo amore buio, pieno di uomini. Via, via. Entra e fatti un bagno caldo. C'è un accappatoio azzurro. Fuori piove un mondo freddo. It's wonderful, it's wonderful, it's wonderful. Good luck, my baby, it's wonderful, it's wonderful, it's wonderful. I dream of the dream of the dream of the dream of the da-di-do-do-do, chibo, chibo, da-di-do-do-do, chibo, chibo, da-di-do-do-do. Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, yeah, I dream of you. Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, yeah, I dream of you. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. You'd like my baby. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. I dream of you. Chips, chips. Da-di-do-do-do, chibo, chibo, da-di-do-do-do, chibo, chibo, da-di-do-do-do.
Great stuff. Thanks, Jim, for the musical interlude. And great to see that we got so many great people in the room, 34 at the moment. Great to have everyone here. Obviously, we've started off on a Eurovision tip, but who knows where this session will go. Just a reminder to everyone to get involved in the activities this week. There's lots going on, hopefully something for everyone. Please use the hashtag SU20Digital and follow us on Twitter, Unions Students, at Union Students. Come and find us on there and you'll stay up to date with everything. Okay, so I filled a little bit of time, like all good live presenters. So I will introduce Jim. Jim is an associate editor for Wonky, and for those of you that didn't catch his session earlier, is a oracle of information. Jim is going to take us through where are we on returning to campus. So Jim, if it's okay with you, I will hand over to you. Just a reminder to people to use the Q&A for questions, and for chat, just use the chat function. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Matt. Afternoon, folks. Lovely to see everyone. Pleasure to be here, up here in my swelteringly hot attic. Hope everyone is well. Before I start, one of the things I was having a conversation with someone about half an hour ago was one of the things that isn't in this presentation, but I think we probably need to think about, partly in relation to the, I think, really good news that has come out of the Oxford vaccine trials over the past 24 hours, is I think most people will be familiar with moments where they are required to sort of wait until a specified time in order to be able to do something, to be let out of a room or to be let into a room, or and so on and so on. And we like to kind of know when we know when something, we're going to be free to do something, or when we're going to be able to do something that allows us to kind of anticipate that and manage it mentally. It's a little bit like being told that you've only got 45 minutes to wait in a queue for a ride at a theme park and so on. I do think one of the really interesting periods that society in general, higher education specifically, is going to go through is a period of time where it becomes clear that a vaccine is coming and there's an estimated date when we're going to get it, but we haven't yet got it. And the reason I think that period is going to be absolutely fascinating is all of the motivation for doing difficult things, like, for example, trying to run a socially distanced campus and trying to run curricula online, may suddenly disappear, because we may as well wait the 3 weeks, the 8 weeks, however long it is, until we, suddenly this kind of chunk of freedom is available. And that's definitely going to be worth thinking about in relation to hopefully the early part of 2021, if the current progress of the vaccine and so on moves at the speed that people say it will. Right, now landlocked creature, where are we on reopening? What I've tried to do here is piece together thousands of kind of tweets, some of my own blogs, some stuff from other UK writers, science boffins, other countries and so on, and try and give a sense of where we are. In some senses, as a result, particularly for those on the call that are Wonky SU subscribers, this is a bit of a sort of now album greatest hits of some of the stuff that certainly we've been doing on reopening and some of the challenges around reopening. But kind of whether you're kind of new to the student movement or an old hand, and whether you're familiar with Wonky or not, hopefully it will provide a fun way to while away an hour as we think about reopening. I want to start with this. So we ran a blog last week on trying to have empathy with students when what they might want is clarity, and that blog was focused very much on marketing. And I think what I'd say is even outside of these kind of debates that are happening right now around the marketing of higher education provision courses and so on, it is pretty clear when you kind of scratch at, and in particular when you look at the qual rather than the quan from some of the surveys that's been going out, is that students are craving empathy, both from their universities and to some extent from their students' unions, but basically from anyone they can, find. And that's going to be, I think, really important in the run up to September, partly because without being, unnecessarily and disproportionately mean to students' unions, students' unions tend to settle into a pattern of communications with students at this time of the year, which frankly, fundamentally, is focused on the selling wristbands. To some extent, what most students' unions aren't doing actively in their comms at this time of year is gathering dissatisfaction, anger, confusion, and so on from students and converting it into student representation. It seems to me that this year, this is a moment where students' unions absolutely have to be doing that. Rather than just kind of doing broad brush relationship stuff and communicating with students about their role. So I think this is a really important time for students' unions to be thinking about the kind of empathy of their comms and so on, both for new students and for continuing students. A couple of things have happened over the weekend that I think it's worth reflecting on before we go any further. First is the news that local directors of public health, so each major local or first tier local authority area has a director of public health. They've been given new powers over the weekend to order what some people are calling micro closures. And this is, the ability to close all sorts of individual businesses, buildings, and so on. The news that directors of public health have been asked by NHS Test and Trace, and the civil servant that's leading on NHS Test and Trace, to investigate the deployment of regional and city-based testing capacity, mobile testing capacity, aimed specifically and squarely at students. And what's interesting about that is that is the first time that we have spotted that, if you like, the health end of public policy in England has noted and specifically talked about students and universities. Now, you can have two reads on this. One is this is typical of the deep ineptitude of the British state. You are free to have that view. Another view would be this is a rapidly developing situation. NHS Test and Trace and the kind of apparatus around it is still pretty new. And it obviously is dealing with the problems that are most immediately in front of it, and there is a reasonable assumption that is based and grounded in truth that university towns and cities aren't yet full of students, but will be. And so lots of the concerns that people have had, certainly I've had around not necessarily generating a COVID secure campus, but a COVID secure community, may well be concerns that, by the looks of it, according to the stuff that we've seen over the weekend, is at least now on the desks of the people that are responsible for public health in the UK and at a local level. So the way in which that might start to manifest itself, not just in mobile testing capacity, but in other initiatives that are designed both to prevent the spread of the virus, but also handle an outbreak, becomes, I think, very interesting in the next couple of 3 months. And the interactions with universities obviously also become interesting in that context. The other thing, though, I thought was really interesting was there's been a sort of never-ending slew of blogs and think pieces and articles and so on emerging from North America, New Zealand, Australia, and so on the reopening of campuses and the transmission of the virus amongst young people, particularly in the US, where young people are now being regarded through the science as the fastest way that the virus is transmitting. Many of you, I guess, will have seen the numbers, I think, from the US about the way in which the virus is transmitting around the US. And you have this interesting, kind of debate that's been happening that, to some extent, we started to have with schools a few weeks ago in the UK, which is your classic traditional young person or student in the US is not at particular risk health-wise from contracting the disease associated with the virus, but is going to be a good way for the virus to transmit and spread. And that appears to be what's happening in the US. So notwithstanding the fact that some young people are very severely affected and there may be some long-term effects that we're not clear on, you've got this paradox of a virus that appears to spread very quickly, particularly relating to the behavior of young people and students, but one that doesn't pose any particular health risks to them, obviously does to the people they might pass it on to. And there's a really interesting, this issue reached Time magazine at the weekend, and I'll put the link up and send that to Matt later for delegates and so on. But the Time magazine piece is a good run through, I think, of the kind of classic issues. To try and inform the stuff that I'm going to talk about, we have had an eye on a bunch of things. So first of all, different parts of the world. So Scandinavia, Central and Southern Europe, North America, Australia and New Zealand and Asia, all of which have particularly interesting kind of relationships with their citizens, the way in which their higher education and education systems work generally, and also the progress of the pandemic has been different in each of those kind of regions. We've tried to keep an eye on those and try and work out what we can learn from those. There are also some tangentially important industries to higher education and student unions specifically, so hospitality, sport, schools, and so on. All of which, there's a significant expectation on the summer, so it's perhaps unlikely, it's unsurprising that there's been a big debate around when each of those sorts of things can open and how they can open and so on. And we kept a close eye on all of that stuff. We kept an eye on what we might call the classic pushers and pullers. And what I mean by that is when you read about people's view on whether students are going to come back in September and what they're going to do and so on, you always have to be a little bit careful because people don't start from a particularly neutral place on lots of this. So, for example, the vast bulk of the market research on whether students are coming back or not in September is from people whose interests it is to create a picture that they are coming back because they're involved in the selling of higher education globally. Yeah, so I have to be a bit careful with some of the research that's come out and put a particular interpretive frame on it. And we've also tried to keep a really close eye on announcements. And what I mean by that is stated intentions about September, as I say, both from North America, from the rest of Europe, Australia and New Zealand and so on. And also, of course, in the UK, all of which was really kicked off by a sort of pre-skirmish from Aberdeen, and then the dual announcements from Cambridge and Bolton, which were basically the same announcement weeks and weeks ago, but with a very different kind of frame on, that then kind of, you know, set off this train of everybody feeling the need to make an announcement about reopening fairly quickly. Now, first thing I wanted to say was, when I originally did a set of slides on this for a webinar that we ran at Wonky called The New Normal, which was back in May, I put a slide together, and you know, one of the things I said was that notwithstanding the fact that the University of Banshire, the you know, kind of satirical marketing Twitter feed that you can see, notwithstanding the fact that Banshire had started talking about, you know, crested masks, was one of my predictions was that once the moral panic about the availability of PPE for medical professionals moved on, you know, in other words, once we got some PPE out to medical professionals, that we would probably end up in a big debate about the supply of and desirability of mandating of personal protective equipment for civilians. And lo and behold, that is obviously the debate we've been having over the past week. And, you know, that is interesting, I think. And it's interesting not because of the debate about masks specifically, but it indicates that there's a hell of a lot of thinking, money, time going into working out how we live alongside the pandemic in more and more sophisticated ways. Hopefully in ways that are more sophisticated than keep 2 meters apart, don't hang out in crowds and so on. And that will inevitably, I think, improve as each week goes on. We're also very slowly starting to see the odd announcement from universities about their approach in relation to these sorts of things. So on the slide there, I've got another example, which is Exeter's VC, Steve Smith, announced to the Festival of Higher Education last week that Exeter would be providing all students with free face coverings and a thermometer. And I'd say two things about that. The free face coverings thing is obviously interesting in the context of the, you know, the wider debate over the weekend and so on about face mask wearing. And you'll notice that what Steve doesn't say there is whether or not Exeter will be mandating the wearing of free face coverings. But the other thing is the provision of a thermometer. Again, what Steve doesn't say there is whether or not Exeter is intending to cause students on a daily or more regular or less regular basis to report their temperature, because you know, you don't provide a thermometer for lols. You're providing a thermometer because it's a way of testing whether or not you have one of the symptoms, which is running a temperature. So, you know, it is interesting, I think, that universities are very slowly over the past week or so starting to come out and talk about some of the things that they might do that go beyond that is being specifically and significantly mandated by public health guidance and so on. And I think we may well see more of that in the coming weeks, partly as a way to deliver on partnership commitments with local authorities and directors of public health, partly as a way to reassure students that might be wavering on safety. And certainly the finding last week from NUS that a third of students are worried about coming back to campus because of safety concerns will doubtless start to feed into some of the working groups and decision making that many of you sit on in the next 6 to 8 weeks. Yes, that's all of that. I've just talked about all of that. The other thing, though, that I said back in May was that I thought there were plenty of reasons to be miserable. And I have to say, I don't think many of the reasons to be miserable have gone away. There is still a very real prospect of a second peak later in the summer or year. And what I'd say about that is that we've already seen that social gatherings get caught up in moral and scientific panics about a second peak. And the reason I separate those is that sometimes there's a scientific panic and a moral panic, and sometimes just a moral panic. So, you know, for example, the scenes of people on beaches is your classic moral panic, even though there wasn't a lot of science behind people panicking about whether or not, you know, the virus was being transmitted on Bournemouth Beach a few weeks back. And of course, into that you can drop students, September, classic moral panics, and the kind of link between that then and, you know, potentially the way in which the virus might be transmitted in September. Already, one of the reasons I highlight that is already we're in a position where students are framed as invasion. Yeah. So, you know, if you cut and shut the sort of moral and scientific panics surrounding a second peak and infection with worry about a second peak or a local outbreak, and you combine that with the usual stuff that people worry about in relation to framing students very much as the other in the local press and so on in September, that's not a particularly pleasant mix of factors. And we've already seen some examples in the UK, but a hell of a lot of examples in Republic of Ireland, North America, New Zealand, Australia, and so on, of this manifesting itself highly problematically, sometimes with some science to back it up, sometimes without some science to back it up. And part of what all of that relates to, I think, is that whilst there is ample evidence that universities have made significant progress on creating what we might call a socially distanced campus, there is actually very little evidence that universities have a proper strategy for creating a COVID-19 safe community. And the central question, which is whether a university's objective is to prevent significant transmission amongst students, or whether its aim is to accept significant transmission amongst students, but to keep students away from a local community, is pretty much unanswered in most university towns and cities, in most of the working groups and so on. And of course, the answer to that question, to some extent, will determine the way in which some of these panics, both moral and scientific, potentially play out in August, September and October. Yes, I've done it again. I've spoken about the slide before I've got there. So yes, there's these issues about mixing. I think the other thing I would say about mixing is lots of the kind of public health strategies that we've had so far have tended to be characterized by a set of assumptions about work, school and living. The interesting thing about being at work for most people is it's a fairly controlled environment, not necessarily because people are shouting at you and telling you what to do all of the time, although that's true in some workplaces, but because you're being watched. You know, there's a level of kind of social control exerted around workplaces, and there's a single bunch of people often that work on a floor or on a shop floor in a factory and whatever, and in theory you can shut down that facility in order to control the virus. Similarly with a school, where people are slightly more worried about secondary schools than junior schools because there's slightly more mixing. Students is a very interesting group of people. If you look at the amount of mixing they do, the number of people they mix with as a result of their academic choices, and the way in which they then go on to mix with people in the local community in most large towns and cities. And you know, for a start, for example, the density of students in many university towns and cities is massive in percentage terms. More students leave home to go to university than in any other city in the world, or than in any other country in the world, almost in the UK. So, you know, the interaction between students, local communities and each other is moderately unique in the UK. But even if you discard the fact that it's unique, study after study in the US is questioning whether or not it's possible either for campuses to be safe or communities to be safe on the assumption that students are coming back in September. And certainly in response to a number of states reporting record levels, numbers of cases so far, a hell of a lot of universities over the past week or so have started to announce that there won't be any face-to-face at all after all, at least for the first term. And, you know, the implications of that for decision making and, you know, thought processes and so on, not least student finance rules and so on in the UK, would be fascinating if we end up there, albeit a little later than anyone would have planned. There are some other things going on, though. So, I mean, this is a picture of people that follow me on Twitter will know that I'm particularly obsessed with this. This is a picture of the Fire Festival. If you've never seen the documentary about the Fire Festival, and the way in which it was marketed in the run-up to it happening, and this sense that you know, it might come off if we keep telling people it will be amazing because that will generate the turnover that will allow the whole project to not fall over. there is I'm probably being a bit mean, but there is a whiff of this about lots of university marketing at the moment. And, you know, it's certainly true to say, I think, that some students' unions who very quite rightly, you know, want to offer a compelling and exciting social program in the new year and in September, either inadvertently or you know in ways that are actually quite uncomfortable behind the scenes, are being dragged into a kind of marketing slipstream that may well be highly problematic by the time that we get to September. It may well be that by the time that returning students realise how little face-to-face contact they're going to get, and by the time new students realise what university is really going to be like in comparison to the prospectus photos and so on, it might be quite miserable. And one of the questions I think, you know, tactically and strategically for students' unions in the next few months will be the way in which, if that anger manifests, a students' union seeks to capture it and use it, because there's obviously a danger that some of that anger gets aimed at the students' union itself. And, you know, it certainly wasn't a smooth ride when some students' unions were kind of caught in the crossfire not 3 or 4 months ago over no detriment policies, and the way in which, you know, representation and campaigning for no detriment policies played out on some campuses and in some universities. The other thing I think it's definitely true to say, talking to lots of students' unions over the past couple of weeks, is that if we know anything, and we also know this from some of the market research firms that we talk to at Wonky, if we know anything, what we do know is that students are further behind on the curve in terms of understanding what September is going to be like. So, you know, there have been plenty of students' unions, I know this, talking to people, that have had conversations with people running clubs and socks over the past couple of weeks who've expressed surprise that, you know, for example, room bookings might not be possible in the first term. And part of that is inevitable, right? We're in the middle of this, you know, we're kind of living and breathing this in the working groups and talking about it every day and so on. But certainly if, for example, our kind of, you know, our volunteer base, our classic donut of 1,500, you know, people who, you know, run all the activities and the clubs and socks and course reps and so on, if they don't really understand where the university's at right now, then, you know, they may end up on the anger end rather than the kind of, you know, acceptance end and problem solving end, which is where arguably we'd want lots of students to be. And so I think there is a really interesting question for students' unions in relation to their kind of activist and influencer base. You know, as I say, the course reps, the clubs and society volunteers, you know, that group of people who kind of eat and breathe their particular chunk of the union, and where they think, you know, the plans for September are at, how it's going to pan out, and their preparedness to contribute to kind of emergency solutions rather than complaining about the problems. What we do know, though, is that in terms of where university planning has been and where university focus has been so far, it's very much been in the centre of what I've been calling the kind of university investment donut. So just to explain this, clearly at the core for lots of universities is the kind of teaching and assessment experience that leads to a qualification. And, you know, you can understand for all sorts of obvious reasons why that might be number one on the list for people to be thinking about and worrying about, not least because it is the one thing that people had to make sure they successfully pivoted to online in March and April. Now, clearly, outside of that core, there's then a bunch of other things going on in most universities around facilities and services. So, you know, places to sit, libraries, so on and so on, you know, facilities and, you know, stuff that people run. And you can only transfer part of that sort of stuff online. Yeah, there's some stuff that librarians can do online, some stuff they can't. They can't give you a virtual chair to sit on if you are desperate to get out of the house because you're where you live is no good for broadband, or your family situation isn't conducive to be able to doing study. So, you know, some of that was replaceable, some was not. And then there's this wider set of things around identity and social capital and experiences. And the folly of trying to shift some of that stuff online is probably best illustrated by the grotesque chaos of some universities maintaining that it's possible to recreate the learning outcomes from a year abroad by having a virtual year abroad. Now, I have no doubt that a virtual year abroad would give me the same opportunities to learn conversational French as a real year abroad, but a virtual year abroad is not the same as a real year abroad for all sorts of really, really, really obvious reasons. And so, you know, yeah, where universities have put their focus partly in, defense of their legal position around consumer rights law. Could do a different webinar on a different day around all of that. But also in terms of developing equivalents, I think has been really interesting. And it's interesting now, I think, because now that we are through the bulk of decision making around teaching and assessment, the truth is in most universities, people are kind of, into the last 10% of the difficulties around trying to program and establish minimums around teaching and assessment. It is these other things, facilities and services, and the wider offer around identity and social capital and mental health and friendship and so on, that actually become really, really important. And to some extent, student unions have a contribution to in terms of delivery, but also will have things to say in terms of, the kind of quality of the replacements that are on offer, if indeed there are any replacements on offer. There's also been a really interesting set of questions raised over the past 4 or 5 weeks, I think, by student unions around student conduct and student behaviour, part of which come from many of those stories in North America. And hopefully people have seen this model that I'll go through in a minute. Joe Walters off of whatever dots, it's 25 dots, I can't remember the dots thing. It's running Comms by the Coast online this week alongside SU 2020. Joe's got this brilliant model where she asks people to think about what students are willing to do, able to do, and then allowed to do, and then think about different students in relation to different types of activity. And certainly if you've not seen this or used this within your own planning or in some of the working groups, I'd very much recommend a look at it. It's a really interesting, fun little model to play with. And for example, Joe in the blog that she wrote for Wonky creates 2, made up students. Here's one, lives in the UK, wealthy, won't be looking for part-time work, able-bodied, live near campus, and doing an English BA, quite happy doing that on Zoom, good network of friends. And contrast that student with someone who lives overseas, hit hard by a second wave of COVID, not sure if they'll be able to get back to the country, exchange rates have made fees more expensive, and so on and so on. And just thinking through what students are allowed to do, able to do, and willing to do, I think is really interesting. But even more interesting than all of that, I think, is if you view, that kind of model, but shot through with kind of not concentric circles, but circles that cross over in that way. Clearly, one of the things that's starting to emerge out of the North American models and the stories and the panics is the stuff in red. And this is stuff that students aren't allowed to do, but they are willing to do and able to do. To mix, to go round each other's houses, to have illegal warehouse raves, and so on. And the reason that space is very, very, very interesting is that student unions, to some extent, are involved in large-scale programs of regulation of student behaviour and conduct, because they have clubs and SOCs that put on social events, and because they work with nightclubs, and because they have their own, entertainment events, and so on and so on. If all of the social mixing is in that sort of red illicit space, people have never dealt with this en masse before. And to some extent, the lessons that are emerging from the US is it doesn't really matter what you say to students. There are enough students that are in that red space to cause a problem for all other students. And so, what on earth the student movement, universities more generally, society in general, I guess, does about that sort of red bit down there in that Venn diagram, I think is going to be a really important contemporary debate in the run up to and during September and October. Here's some of the stories that have kind of emerged. Every hour, I think, we get new alerts at Wonky with our media monitoring about some of those stories. As you can see from the bottom left, some of those stories are UK-based, not just US-based. They even manifested themselves in Anthony Fauci pleading with young people at the weekend to stop going out and sort of hanging out. You're propagating the pandemic, he said. And again, it's at least a... you can imagine, these sorts of concerns starting to manifest themselves in relation to September. So yes, how will students behave? Will we end up with students in 2 camps, the sort of safety conscious and lonely students versus the kind of carefree and dangerous students? Will students get the blame anyway? And I mean, the other thing I've been thinking about a lot over the past week, and I haven't been thinking about it for about 6 weeks because I've been trying to block it out. As of today, right, it remains the case that the official guidance is that you have symptoms, you have to go home and tell everyone in your house, and then everyone in your house self-isolates for 2 weeks. Okay. Now, for a start, if you live in an HMO with 9 other students, in theory, that means you go home, tell your landlord, and then your landlord announces to the other 9 people that live in your house that you have got the virus and that everyone else has to stay in for 2 weeks. You might not want to do that. You might think the landlord will evict you. You might think you'll get deported. You might not want to be unpopular. You might, in order to not be unpopular or because of the other reasons, just put that cough down to, oh, I don't know, you know, it must have been, you know, going out for a drink last night or something rather than COVID. So, you know, those issues around shame and inconvenience and so on are a real issue. And then, of course, here's the thing. Even if you tell the landlord, the other people in your house and so on, what do you do if they then ignore it and they kind of roam around, you know, sort of, you know, infecting other people potentially? You know, are you supposed to grass them up? How does all of this, you know, how does all of this work around, you know, track and trace, self-isolation and so on and so on? And one of the things that I think is very interesting, for example, is when you design a system of test, track and trace that is very focused on a university, you can adapt the messages, you can adapt the apps, and you can adapt the behaviors, and you can adapt the kind of training and induction. So, for example, there's a number of universities in North America that have taken this particular problem and started to roll out their own symptom tracking app. You know, I think many people have got the symptom tracking app that King's brought out, you know, a few weeks into the pandemic, and very specifically adapted messages, and have got their own track and trace capacity inside a university that, you know, once you say you've got symptoms, he's then going to be able to follow up and will understand, you know, the kind of campus and courses and so on and so on and so on. Now, you know, will a university do that because it thinks it's a good thing to do from a market perspective? Will some universities feel that they should do that in conjunction with their local director of public health? Are there some student unions who will say, in order to address the concerns of those students who won't feel safe, we want the university to take that kind of approach that goes, you know, beyond what's currently on offer from NHS, test and trace and so on? What pressure and communication will be placed on HMO landlords, or indeed those people that run the large, you know, PBSA private halls blocks? You know, is a household a whole flat, and so on and so on and so on. And, you know, it's fairly clear, I think, that this level of understanding around how students mix, where they live, and what their behavioural responses are likely to be to other people with symptoms, and indeed their behavioural responses to their own symptoms, really do need thinking through, working in partnership with students over testing in terms of what messages would work and so on. And probably, you know, to cut a very long story short, if you've not read Gary Hughes's blog off of Chief Exec at Durham Students' Union, please do read it on the site. Probably not reaching for punish them as your first, as you know, your first response. Let's discuss the punishments if people break the rules. It's probably not where you start from on all of this. It's probably where, you know, it's probably one of the things you might end up with in a list of 40 options. But, you know, defaulting to disciplinary procedures is probably not wise on this wider question of students. And the reason, by the way, that I think all of that is really important is lots of students' unions might not view that as being their personal responsibility. But, you know, that thing about students' unions having a role in talking about and talking up students rather than just themselves as, you know, great charities and great organizations, it seems to me points towards a need for students' unions to disproportionately intervene in these questions because of the likelihood that students will be painted in a viciously negative light because of some of the things they might do in relation to their behavior. So, you know, the broader sort of responsibility that students' unions have around the identity of and the way in which students are treated in communities, it seems to me, you know, as I say, necessitates a level of interaction in that debate in the coming weeks that, you know, perhaps some students' unions weren't necessarily ready for. Lots of that I've talked about, of course, relates more broadly to wider questions of autonomy and control across the university sector. And, you know, again, this is a different webinar for a different day, but of course, we operate in the UK in a scenario, in a system where there is significant amounts of university autonomy. Universities are broadly free and claim their autonomy to do as they wish. But one of the downsides of that is they end up getting the bill for dealing with lots of these issues. And again, one of the things where the jury is out, I think, at the moment on this stuff I've talked about, which is broadly about the relationship between public health policy in a local area and universities, is who will pick up blame, responsibility, and the bill. And, you know, there are some very firm traditions, I think, in the US around universities getting the blame, the responsibility, and the bill that aren't quite as simple to transpose in the UK. But, you know, certainly that will be a kind of underpinning tussle that it's important that people factor in when they're trying to influence this sort of stuff around the edges. It's also, of course, true that universities have made a hell of a lot of positive commitments in the sort of spaces that I've just talked about in relation to the way in which universities will handle a pandemic. Universities have, you know, been very positive. Senior managers have been very positive. You know, I've heard from lots of students' unions who've said that their officers or their staff, you know, have asked, you know, quite grumpy questions in some meetings and been told, you know, told off for being negative. It won't be possible, folks, for universities to meet all of the promises they've made for every student on every course in every kind of aspect. And, you know, if you add them all up, something's got to give. And one of the things that will be interesting to watch, and one of the things you'll definitely want to watch as a students' union, is which of those sorts of promises are the ones where people run out of time or budget or space. Because time is ticking on, you know, there isn't all the money in the world, and September, you know, is now just a few weeks away when you add in various chunks of annual leave. One of the things that some people have done, which I think is a very interesting exercise, and it's worth keeping an eye on this, you know, certainly we're going to be doing that at Wonkhe, is looking at the way in which different cultures and countries have responded to the pandemic in relation to higher education and students. And in that Time magazine piece, there's a really interesting example that is drawn from Taiwan, for example. In Taiwan, the Ministry of Education, so the equivalent of the Department for Education in England, produced a national strategy for college campuses. And it includes all sorts of fascinating things. So initial quarantine of all students, not just international students. Frequent testing of all students, so every few days of all students. Relentless cleaning, obviously, and compulsory mask wearing and social distancing measures. Reduction of student density in halls and stuff, cleaning of halls twice a day, mandatory quarantine with, you know, kind of funded quarantine blocks for anyone exposed, and calculated infection number thresholds at which an entire university would shut down. Now, a few things to say about this. There is a reason why the UK, the US, and, you know, similar cultures have much more favoured on the axis between freedom from harm and freedom to do things towards freedom to do things. And, you know, that's about culture and traditions and so on. Lots of wider debates, for instance, about Boris Johnson's general view about individual rights and liberty. And the other thing to say is that one of the things that has definitely happened in the past 10 years, really clearly, is the left has come to be associated with safety and protection and looking after people. The right, particularly the Brexit right, has come to be associated with notions of individual freedom. So it's not a surprise, really, that the UK government, that's basically run by Brexiteers, has an instinct, even though it often pivots towards safety, has an instinct around individual freedoms. And so we are unlikely to see nationally mandated, right, close all the universities. Do you know what I mean? We're just not going to see that sort of stuff, even if people would like it to happen. However, one of the things we have seen so far throughout the course of the pandemic is that both local government and national government pivots on individual issues when the pressure builds. Some people would call that U-turns, around the concept of protection and safety. And look, mark my words, folks, if it gets to the point where there are, you know, 10 you know, big citywide cases, and a trope emerges in the press of students, you know, being the sources of transmission of the virus, you know, it's not at all beyond the realm of possibility that Matt Hancock has to stand up on one of those press conferences and announce campus closures nationally. It's not beyond the realm of possibility if you look at what's happened so far in the pandemic. So it won't be planned. People won't have thought it through beforehand. The implications around, you know, completing the academic year, how much more complicated that would be in comparison to what we had to go through in March and so on. You know what that would be like. Yeah, all sorts of things to think about there. But I think it's probably moderately likely, at least factoring into the thinking, and certainly factoring into the kind of, you know, the contingency plans that you would hope that both universities themselves and students' unions are making, that sort of thing could happen because of the nature of society that we have. The other thing to say, though, about that debate between freedom from harm and freedom to behave is that that debate obviously exists amongst students, amongst academic staff. It's probably fair to say that students' unions generally, if you were to take their political temperature, have been on the freedom from harm side of things. Certainly if you do freedom from harm versus freedom to speak, students' unions have traditionally been on the side of, you know, the kind of prizing freedom from harm. There is likely to be in September a whole range of ways in which battles between groups of students and between groups of students and academic and professional services staff on university campuses, and indeed the way in which universities and local communities interact, which are characterized by a battle between freedom from harm and freedom to, you know, not wear a mask, or freedom to hang around in groups, or whatever that might be. And certainly we are starting to get rumblings of individual UCU branches expressing really strong, deep concern on freedom from harm grounds about being asked to come back to campus to teach, the activities they might be asked to undertake, the level of mixing they might have to undertake with students, and so on. And, you know, another thing I would say is that it makes lots of sense, I think, for students' unions to be talking very closely this summer to Unison, UCU, GMB, Unite branches, about, you know, approaches to reopening, concerns, and so on, before you again potentially end up in, you know, kind of industrial action style scenarios where academic staff are being told they have to come in, but, you know, don't feel that it's been safe enough. And, you know, we certainly might see shades of the sort of debates we've seen in schools play out on university campuses. I won't go into this stuff about common good university campuses too much, but I'll send that out on the slides. The other thing I've been talking about now for 2 or 3 weeks, and, you know, apologies to those people who are SU subscribers, because you'll have heard, you know, some of this to the kind of blue in the face. But in response to some of the discussions we've been having, both with students' unions and universities a few weeks ago, we sort of threw this little model together, and hopefully it's useful for some people. This is a way of trying to think through not the COVID crisis from the perspective of a kind of university estates function, or a university teaching and learning function, or a timetabling function. And certainly we picked up from lots of students' unions that they were the sorts of conversations they were having, you know, conversations that were fundamentally about the management of facilities and the management of timetables and teaching commitments. This is hopefully a way of thinking through, you know, how students will spend their week. Now, a kind of student-centered approach, God forbid. Clearly, this will be different for different courses, different types of student, different universities, different campuses, and so on. But hopefully it's a way of starting to tease out some of the issues that manifest in some of the planning that's been done. So across the top there, you can see that differentiates between stuff that is facilitated and programmed versus stuff that is self-organized or organic. Across the kind of vertical axis, you'll see that differentiates between what we might call formal teaching and learning activity and kind of wider social, extracurricular, leisure activity, part-time work, and so on. And then the sort of purple-green split, if you imagine this model in 3D, the purple-green split is whether you can, should, will run activity in that space online or offline. A few things to say about this. First is, it's pretty clear that the bulk of university planning in the first few weeks around September was absolutely obsessed with box A, and a lot of space and capacity has been used up with trying to fit as much formal contact as possible into box A, potentially to the detriment of box B. And what I'd say about box B is, if, for example, a student has 10 hours of contact hours a week, in theory, they've got 20, 25 other hours a week for self-directed learning. And lots of students do that self-directed learning on campus, either because they don't have the facilities at home, or because they're doing it in groups, or because they're using labs or decent Wi-Fi or whatever on campus. And if lots of the space on campus has been used up with Box A, which obviously is the sort of thing that, you know, academics think about a lot, we might be sleepwalking into a really interesting capacity problem in relation to, if you like, Box B. Clearly, student unions have got lots to say, think about, and do in relation to Box C, and lots of student unions be kind of dumped with making broad brush commitments happen on social activity and so on. But I think the other thing that's pretty clear that lots of people are saying is that successful online pivots really are more in the C box than the D box. And to some extent, students were okay, lots of them in sort of March, April and May, because they'd already made a series of friendships in that C box. And if all of a sudden, you know, there has to be lots more activity in the C box than the D box in order for it to kind of work, whether there's the capacity to do that, the time to do it, the actual space in, you know, big marquees on campus and so on becomes really important. It's certainly true that in our wider loneliness work about 18 months ago, we identified, for example, that there was a tendency to focus Box C activity, if you like, this before the pandemic, on new students at the start of the academic year, and that what students really did want was right throughout their time at university, there to be a focus on stuff put on for them that's organised, and also a focus on that happening throughout the course of the academic year rather than just at the start of the year. So, you know, the way in which student unions are able to work both with the people that put the activities on, clubs and societies and so on, but also universities to make some of that Box C stuff happen becomes really important. And certainly over the past couple of weeks, we've had a number of conversations with sort of pro-vice chancellors for learning and teaching type people about the way in which academics that are running courses and programs and modules for students might, you know, take a more active role in causing there to be some structured activities in that kind of social space in Box C, in lieu of students being able to just kind of hang around in queues for lecture theatres in the way that they perhaps used to. So hopefully that's helpful for people. There's a blog on that on the site and so on, some extra, you know, bits and bobs around it and so on. Right, I'm just going to close now on 3 slides and then, you know, very quickly see if there's any questions. So clearly most people have been through what I would call phase 1, the pivot. Won't go into that into too much detail. Clearly most people are now getting out the back of phase 2, which has been a relentless focus on the teaching, although some issues remain, particularly for courses that depend a lot on practical components, and also courses that, with all the will in the world, you can't really run simultaneously online with 15 people and online with 15 people synchronously and simultaneously. And I think lots of universities are starting to realize what blended really means a little late, but most universities are now through that phase and are getting to what we might call phase 3. Not everything is possible. Time is running out. Anger is coming in August for continuing students, and for new students potentially in October and November. And as I said before, it seems to me that it's really important for student unions to think about how that anger, if and when it manifests itself, gets channeled, picked up and turned into productive student representation, particularly from the perspective of a set of what are often fairly subject-specific teaching and learning issues for student unions that often are dealing with institutions in their generality, rather than some of the subject-specific challenges that often manifest. So, you know, if I had any advice to student unions, it would be to have a think about how to prep up for and intervene on phase 3. Second piece of advice, just to end, is I do think the next 6 weeks is all going to be about safety for all of the reasons that I talked about earlier. Won't go into that into any more detail. But I think where that finally gets us is a set of questions. What's the union for in the year ahead? The messages probably have to be different to the messages that, you know, we were dusting off from this time last year. Whether or not the students' union and the university is ahead of or behind the local high street and the local community is going to be really important from a COVID secure and safety point of view. The way we regulate student activity and student activities is going to be really important Imagine that training we all used to do for initiation ceremonies, but now saying to clubs and society captains, you can't organise any socials ever. That's going to be a challenge, but a challenge you probably need to have a think about addressing. And then, you know, some of these other questions around what the representation model is, trying to hold on to educational changes that have been beneficial, like lecture capture and changes to extenuating circumstances policies. And I guess the final one I'd just highlight is it always was and it always will be about the numbers. Not just about the number of people that enroll, that will be really important to universities for obvious reasons, but also about who enrolls and frankly, who's already dropped out. A whole bunch of people have already dropped out. It won't be consistent across student characteristics and types. And knowing that and being able to you know, prepare to answer the question about why people have and why people might be about to drop out will really put the Students' Union right at the centre of questions both about institutional survival, but also student interest issues that really matter from a student representation perspective. And on that bombshell, I will stop talking. Thank you, Matt.
Great stuff. Thanks, Jim. You're always good at filling the time, certainly. So just going round. Does anyone have any questions for Jim? Feel free to put your hand up, or if you don't want to talk, put it in the Q&A. Give a couple of minutes. Penny. Penny, I'm going to give you control if you'd like to just make your question.
Hi, so my question is, what is Jim's advice on how to navigate around representing demanding needs from students? Because there are students who would DM us SU officers to say that they absolutely want to come to campus, but there are students who absolutely don't want to come to campus. So what sort of things should we argue for in terms of, you know, lobbying the university to prioritize on?
Well, look, let me say two fairly glib things in relation to this, which neither of which are massively helpful, but you know, I've certainly been talking to people about over the past couple of weeks. One of the things I think that we're used to in Students' Union land is taking those sort of two groups of students that we might have characterised earlier in my slides as kind of, you know, right wing or left wing in student movement terms, or sort of, you know, safety conscious or freedom conscious or whatever. We're used to quite often using democratic structures to work out who wins. Now, that if nothing else, what I would say is we got to go nowhere near that being the answer this time, for really, really obvious reasons. So, you know, is it the case that, for example, a group of 9 elected officers may well look at some groups of students who, you know, willfully, you know, transmit the virus and might say, oh my God, we've got to condemn these people. This is terrible. I mean, probably. But, you know, I think to some extent, the role of students' unions in the next 6 to 8 weeks is to feed in some of these realities to universities and cause universities to think about how to fix them in conjunction with us. But in the end, this can't be our problem. So, look, is it important that universities understand that some people are craving freedom for all sorts of really important reasons and are also getting constant messages being told that the virus isn't of much impact on their health? That's absolutely true. Is it also true that there's a whole bunch of students who are terrified about coming back to campus, infecting local people, perhaps in, you know, in Exeter or wherever we're talking about, and are also worried about their own family or indeed their own health? That's absolutely true. I think the other thing that I would say is, some of the more interesting projects that I've seen in North America are at least preparing to cause there to be a conversation between those sorts of attitudes being expressed by students on campus to each other in the first few weeks. And look, I'd say, you know, very quickly, 2 things about that. The UK is traditionally absolutely useless at that kind of social induction where students understand the kind of perspectives of and views of other students. Yeah, the closest you get to it is people having to do kind of online webinars about consent, or having to do unconscious bias training online, rather than some of the more interesting things that are done in the US sometimes, which is about groups of students discussing diversity, different students, and so on. I think what I would be doing, I would be begging universities with every last bit of capacity they have to cause there to be more discussion and more understanding between students that hold different attitudes, rather than that being kind of expressed through the lightning rod of the inbox of an elected officer, because that doesn't help. It's not fair, and in the end it doesn't resolve the issue. In the end what you want is a level of community understanding, rather than an individual selfish student on one side of that debate or the other, just to take a pound of flesh out of a sab.
Does that answer your question, Penny?
Yes, thank you. That was really helpful.
Great stuff. Just a viewpoint to anyone else for a final question? I think that piece for student unions to be that conduit for that opportunity for the institution to have real student voices in front of it with differing opinions is probably more relevant than ever, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're there. Thank you, Jim, as always. Pleasure to have you, and pleasure for to have obviously the delegates that are with us. Loads more stuff going on today and over the rest of the week. Thank you all. Have a great day.